paper was still on the nightstand when Diana Harlow finally stopped pretending she was asleep. She had placed it there hours ago, smoothed it flat with her thumb as if straightening it might change what was written on it, and then turned off the lamp and told herself it meant nothing. It was a phone number. Just a phone number. People wrote phone numbers on scraps of paper all the time. Marcus was a real estate agent. He met strangers for a living. But it was now past midnight. The bedroom was dark and quiet, and her husband was breathing steadily beside her while she stared at the ceiling and felt something she could not quite name pressing against the inside of her chest. Diana was not a dramatic woman. That was something people said about her often, sometimes as a compliment, and sometimes as the kind of observation that carried a quiet edge, as if being calm in difficult moments made her less feeling rather than more careful. She had built her flower shop from a single rented cooler and a folding table at a farmer's market 6 years ago, and she had done it without investors, without a business partner, and without once raising her voice at a supplier who shorted her on stock. She understood that most problems responded better to patience than to panic. She believed that, and she had lived by it for a long time. She was 42 years old. She had dark hair she wore long, a pair of tortoiseshell glasses she only recently stopped resisting, and hands that were almost always slightly scratched from working with stems and wire, and the wooden crates she received deliveries in every Tuesday and Friday morning. She was not the kind of woman who went looking for trouble. She also was not the kind of woman who could lie in the dark next to a man and pretend her mind was quiet when it wasn't. The evening had started the way most Sunday evenings started. She had come home from the shop a little after 6, still carrying the faint smell of eucalyptus and cold water on her skin, and found Marcus at the kitchen counter going through his email on his laptop. He had glanced up, said something about traffic, and gone back to the screen. She had made dinner. They had eaten without much conversation, which was no longer unusual. Over the past several months, the silences between them had grown longer and somehow more textured, filled with things neither of them was quite saying. She had told herself it was the natural rhythm of a marriage settling into its middle years. Two people tired from working, too comfortable for performance. She had told herself that more than once. After dinner, she gathered the laundry she had been meaning to get to all weekend. Marcus's dress pants, the ones he had worn to a showing on Friday, were folded over the back of the chair in the corner of their bedroom. She picked them up, checked the pockets the way she always did before anything went into the wash, and found it. A small square of paper, torn from something larger, folded twice. She opened it. A phone number, written in blue ink, in handwriting she did not recognize. No name, no context, just 10 digits and nothing else. She stood there for a moment, holding it, and then walked to the living room where Marcus had moved with his laptop after dinner. "Hey," she said, keeping her voice easy. "I found this in your pants pocket. Whose number is it?" He looked at the paper without sitting up straighter, without any shift in his posture that she could identify as significant. "Probably a client," he said. "I was showing a place over on Clearwater on Friday, and this woman was interested but wasn't ready to commit. She handed me her number on whatever she had in her purse." He glanced back at his screen. "I should put it in my phone before I forget." He reached for the paper. She handed it to him, watched him type the number into his contacts, and set the scrap on the edge of the coffee table. And that was that. She went back to the laundry. He went back to his email. And yet, she had not been able to identify what bothered her about the exchange, and that was precisely the problem. He had not flinched. He had not over-explained. He had not looked at her with that particular kind of careful steadiness that people sometimes manufactured when they were working hard to appear unbothered. He had simply answered her and moved on, which was either because he was telling the truth or because he was very, very good at this. She loaded the washing machine. She folded the things that were already dry. She put away the dishes from the drying rack and wiped down the counter and did all of it quietly, waiting to see if the feeling would pass. It did not pass. By the time they went to bed, Marcus had fallen asleep within minutes, the way he always did, with an ease that Diana had once found endearing and now sometimes envied. She lay beside him with her eyes open, listening to the low hum of the neighborhood settling into the night, and she thought about the past several months with a clarity that surprised her. He had started traveling more in the spring, weekend trips to meet clients in surrounding areas, he said, because the market had opened up and buyers were coming from out of state. She had not questioned it, because there was nothing specific to question. Just a gradual increase in nights away, a gradual decrease in the kinds of small conversations that couples have without thinking, the ones about nothing in particular that add up to a kind of intimacy over years. He had started keeping his phone face down on the table. He had started taking calls in the garage. She had noticed each of these things individually and filed them away in a part of her mind she did not visit often, because she knew that if she looked at them all together, she would have to do something about what she saw. She was looking at them together now. Diana sat up slowly, careful not to disturb him. The scrap of paper was where she had last seen it. He had left it on the coffee table instead of throwing it away, which meant either it genuinely did not concern him or he had simply forgotten about it, in the way people forgot about things that were no longer necessary. She picked it up. She turned it over in her hands in the dim light from the hallway. She thought about going back to bed. Instead, she walked to the kitchen, took her own phone from her bag, and set it on the counter. Marcus's phone was on the charger beside the refrigerator. He had never put a password on it. They had discussed it once, early in their marriage, and agreed that privacy in a partnership was about trust, not access, and that neither of them had anything to hide. She wondered briefly when that conversation had started to mean different things to each of them. She picked up his phone. She found the number she had watched him add to his contacts earlier that evening. She pressed call. She held the phone to her ear and listened to it ring once, twice, and then a woman's voice, low and warm and completely unguarded, answered on the third ring. "Hey, love, can you talk?" Diana ended the call. She stood in the kitchen without moving for a long moment, her hand still holding the phone, the silence around her so complete she could hear the faint drip of the faucet she had been meaning to ask Marcus to fix for 3 weeks. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car moved slowly down the street and its headlights swept briefly across the kitchen wall. The woman had not said hello. She had not said, "Who is this?" or "I think you have the wrong number." She had answered with the ease of someone who already knew exactly who was calling. And she had used a word that did not belong in a professional exchange between a real estate agent and a client who had handed him her number at a showing on a Friday afternoon. Diana set his phone back on the charger. She was careful to replace it at the same angle it had been sitting before. She stood there another moment, making sure her breathing was slow and her hands were steady. And then she went to the small drawer beside the stove, where she kept rubber bands and take-out menus and things that didn't have another home, and she placed the scrap of paper inside it. Then she went to her own phone, opened the camera, and photographed the screen showing the outgoing call she had just made. The number, the time, the duration. 14 seconds. She screenshot it and saved it to a folder she kept for receipts and store warranties, in between a photo of a parking permit and an appliance manual. Somewhere ordinary. Somewhere she would remember. She did not know yet what she was going to do with any of it. She did not know how long this had been happening, or how far it had gone. or whether the woman on the other end of that call would be calling Marcus back in the next 5 minutes, wondering why he had hung up. She did not know anything beyond 14 seconds of a voice saying 2 words with a warmth that told her everything she had been choosing not to see. She turned off the kitchen light and went back to the bedroom. Marcus was still sleeping. She lay down beside him and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular kind of grief that comes not from a sudden blow, but from recognizing something that was always there, something you walked past every day and told yourself was a shadow, until the light changed and you finally saw it clearly. She was not going to cry tonight. She was not going to wake him up and ask him to explain himself at 1 in the morning with her voice breaking and her hands shaking, giving him the advantage of catching her at her worst. She knew herself well enough to know that if she confronted him now, she would be reacting, and Diana Harlow did not react. She was going to wait until morning. She was going to make coffee, and she was going to put that piece of paper on the table. And she was going to look at her husband of 11 years across the kitchen and ask him one question. She was going to ask it once, quietly, and she was going to watch his face. And whatever happened after that, she would be ready. She did not sleep. Not really. She drifted in and out of something that felt more like the edge of sleep than sleep itself. A shallow place where her thoughts kept moving even when her eyes were closed, cycling through the same details the way water circles a drain. The woman's voice, the ease of it, the word she had used. Diana would start to sink toward something darker and quieter, and then resurface again, blinking at the ceiling, Marcus's breathing unchanged beside her. At some point, the room began to lighten at the edges of the curtains. She heard a bird start up somewhere close, then another. She watched the gray of the ceiling slowly separate itself from the shadows in the corners, and she thought about the first years of their marriage, when she and Marcus used to make coffee together on Sunday mornings, before either of them was fully awake, bumping into each other in the kitchen and laughing at nothing in particular. She thought about a trip they had taken to the coast for their 5th anniversary, a small rented cottage 2 blocks from the water, and how she had woken early every morning just to sit outside and listen to the ocean while he slept. She had thought, on those mornings, that she was the luckiest kind of tired, the tired that comes from a life that is genuinely full. She was not sure when the fullness had started to empty. She was not sure whether it had happened to both of them at the same time, or whether Marcus had begun to quietly withdraw long before she allowed herself to feel it. These were not questions she would be able to answer this morning, and she understood that trying to answer them would only pull her sideways when she needed to stay straight. She got up at 6:15 and went to the bathroom and washed her face with cold water, and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. The face that looked back at her was composed, which surprised her a little. She had expected to look the way she felt, hollowed out, slightly bruised around the eyes. But she looked like herself. She looked like a woman who had made a decision and was carrying it carefully, making sure not to drop it before she reached the place she was going. She went to the kitchen and started the coffee. While it brewed, she opened the small drawer beside the stove and took out the piece of paper. She placed it at Marcus's spot at the kitchen table, to the left of his mug, where he would see it the moment he sat down. She did not add anything to it. She did not write a note or arrange anything else around it. Just the paper, just the number, sitting there in the early morning light, like a question that had already been answered. She poured her coffee and sat across from it and waited. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the ones she had learned to recognize over 11 years, the way you learn the sounds of a house, involuntarily, without meaning to, He appeared in the kitchen doorway in the clothes he slept in, his hair not yet combed, reaching automatically for the coffee pot. He poured his mug. He turned toward the table. He saw the paper. It lasted less than a second. The change in his face, a tightening around his eyes, a fractional stillness, something that was gone almost before it arrived. Then he sat down, wrapped his hands around his mug, and looked at her. "Diana." "Who is she?" she said. Not loudly, not with any tremor in her voice. She asked it the way she would ask him what time he was expected somewhere, plainly and without decoration, because she had decided somewhere around 4 in the morning that she was not going to perform her pain for him. He did not deserve the performance. He started with the client's story again, the showing on Clearwater, the woman who wasn't ready to commit. He said it with almost the same ease he had used the night before, and she let him finish. And then she looked at him steadily and told him that she had called the number. She watched him understand. It moved across his face slowly, the way weather moves across an open field. First a shift in light, then a stillness, then something that looked almost like relief, which was the part that hurt the most, as if carrying this had been exhausting and being caught meant he could finally put it down. "She answered from your phone," Diana said. "She knew it was you." He put his mug down, he looked at the table, and then he told her. Not everything, she was certain of that, but enough. He had met her several months ago during a property negotiation, a woman named, and here Diana held up one hand slightly, just barely, a small gesture that stopped him. She did not need the name right now. She did not need the specific geography of it. What she needed was the shape of it, the outline, so she could understand what she was actually dealing with. He said they had started with work conversations. He said it had moved into messages, then phone calls, then something he called a connection, using the word with a kind of careful deliberateness that made her understand he had been thinking about how to describe it for some time. He said nothing physical had happened. He said he didn't know how it had gotten this far. He said he was sorry, and he said it more than once, with an expression that she believed was genuinely remorseful, which did not make it easier. It would have been simpler if he had looked defiant. Instead, he looked like a man who had made something small and manageable in his own mind until it wasn't, and who was now sitting across from the consequence of that. "Do you understand," she said after a moment, "what it means that she called you love? That she answered that way? That she already knew exactly who was on the other end?" He didn't say anything. "That's not a miscommunication," she said. "That's not two people who got a little too friendly over email. She answered that phone the way a woman answers when the man calling her has made her feel certain of something." He looked up. "I know. So when you say nothing physical happened, I need you to understand that I don't think that's the part that matters most to me right now." He started to say something about being confused, about the past year being harder than she knew, about feeling invisible in ways he hadn't known how to articulate. She listened to all of it, without interrupting, because she had learned long ago that interrupting a person mid-explanation usually gave them a way out of finishing it. She wanted him to finish it. She wanted to hear every word he chose. When he was done, she asked him one more question. "If I had been the one to do this," she said, "what would you have done?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the answer became unnecessary. She stood up from the table. She moved through the kitchen and down the hallway and up the stairs with the same deliberateness she had been carrying all morning. And she went to the closet and took out her larger bag, the one she used for weekend trips, and she began to pack. She was not frantic about it. She did not throw things. She moved the way she moved in the shop when she was working against a deadline. Methodically, without wasted motion, her mind already several steps ahead of her hands. She took enough clothes for a week and a half. She took her toiletries, her vitamins, the book on her nightstand. She went to the small fireproof box she kept on the top shelf of the closet, the one Marcus knew about but had never had a reason to open, and she took out her passport, her social security card, and the copies she kept of their marriage certificate and the deed to the shop. She took the folder from the filing cabinet in the corner of the room, the one she had labeled Household in a blue marker 2 years ago, which held summaries of their joint accounts, their insurance policies, and the information on the investment account Marcus had set up during the second year of their marriage and managed almost entirely on his own. She was not taking these things to punish him. She was taking them because she was a practical woman, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her given how little she had slept, that the next phase of this was not going to be simple. He had followed her upstairs. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom while she packed, alternating between apology and explanation in a way that told her he was not entirely sure which one was more likely to work. He asked her not to go. He said they could talk about this, that they should talk about this, that leaving wasn't going to solve anything, and she was making a permanent decision out of a moment that wasn't what she thought it was. She zippered the bag. She took her work phone charger from the outlet beside the bed, coiled it, tucked it into the front pocket. "Diana, please." She picked up the bag and looked at him. Not with anger. She was surprised to find that what she felt, standing there, was not anger at all. It was something quieter and more final, like the feeling of finishing something, of reading the last page of a book you had spent a long time with, and closing it gently and setting it down. "I'm going to Carol's," she said. She carried the bag past him, down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the door. She put the bag in the trunk. She sat in the driver's seat and placed both hands on the steering wheel and breathed for a moment. Just breathed, looking at the house through the windshield. Then she started the car and pulled out of the driveway. She made it 4 blocks before the tears came, all at once and without warning, the way they always do when you've been holding something too carefully for too long. She pulled over on a quiet side street lined with oak trees, their branches thick with the full weight of summer. And she let herself cry for exactly as long as she needed to. She did not fight it, and she did not rush it. When it was over, she found a tissue in her bag, wiped her face, and looked at herself in the rearview mirror. Then she put the car in drive and kept going. She didn't know yet what Marcus was doing in the hours she spent settling into Carol's spare room, unpacking the bag she had packed with such careful precision, hanging the 2 blouses on the back of the door because there was no closet space. She didn't know that by that same evening, the phone he had used to carry on a quiet, hidden life would light up with a message from a woman who had no idea that everything had just changed. She didn't know that the morning she had just survived was not, in fact, the most difficult part of what was coming. She only knew that the spare room had a window that faced the backyard, and that when she sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the late morning light coming through the leaves, it was the first time in months she had felt like she could breathe all the way down. Carol Bennett did not say much when Diana arrived. She opened the door, looked at her cousin's face, looked at the bag over her shoulder, and stepped aside to let her in. She made tea instead of asking questions, and she set a plate of toast on the kitchen table, even though Diana said she wasn't hungry. And she sat across from her in the particular way that Carol had always had, close enough to be present, far enough not to press. They had grown up 3 streets apart, spent summers in each other's backyards, and had the kind of relationship built on enough shared history that silence between them was never uncomfortable. It was, in fact, one of the things Diana had always valued most about her cousin. Carol understood that some things needed to be said on their own timeline. Diana ate the toast without realizing she was doing it. She told Carol what had happened, beginning with the paper in the pocket and ending with the drive over. And Carol listened to all of it without interrupting, without the sharp intake of breath or the wide-eyed reaction that Diana had been unconsciously dreading from anyone she told. When Diana finished, Carol was quiet for a moment, and then she said simply that she was glad Diana had called. "I didn't call," Diana said. "I just showed up." "I know," Carol said. "I'm glad you did that instead." The spare room was small and smelled like lavender from a candle Carol kept on the dresser, and the mattress was softer than Diana was used to, and all of it should have made sleep difficult. Instead, she slept for almost 10 hours that first night, a dense, dreamless sleep that left her feeling scraped clean when she woke, emptied out in a way that was uncomfortable, but also, underneath the discomfort, something close to honest. As if her body had finally been given permission to stop pretending. The messages from Marcus started that first evening and continued without interruption through the following days. Some of them were apologetic in a way that felt genuine, long messages where he circled the same territory, that he had not meant for it to go as far as it had, that he understood why she left, that he wanted to fix what he had broken. Others were shorter and carried a different tone, the kind of message that arrives after someone has spent several hours alone with their own frustration and started to reframe events in a way that cast them as less responsible than they initially admitted to being. In those, he referred to the situation as a misunderstanding that she was choosing to treat as something larger. He used the phrase emotional affair once in quotation marks, as if the term itself was an overreaction rather than an accurate description. He said she was making a permanent decision based on an incomplete picture. Diana read all of them. She responded to none of them. On the fourth day, Carol sat beside her on the back porch in the early evening and asked her, carefully, what she was thinking about doing. Diana said she didn't know yet. Carol nodded. She looked out at the yard, where the light was going gold and long across the grass. Then she said something she would say only once, quietly, without any particular emphasis, the way people say the most important things. She said that the question wasn't really about a phone call or a piece of paper. The question was about whether Marcus had told the truth when he'd had the chance to, and he hadn't. He had looked at her, held the paper in his own hands, and constructed a story. The phone call hadn't revealed a mistake. It had revealed a choice he had already made before Diana ever asked the question. Diana sat with that for a long time after Carol went inside. She thought about the showing on Clearwater, the client who wasn't ready to commit, the handwriting on the paper that she had known, even in that first moment of looking at it, was not the handwriting of someone filling out a contact form. She thought about the months of face-down phones and garage phone calls, and the gradual, almost imperceptible disappearance of her husband from their shared life. She thought about how she had narrated each of those things to herself as something reasonable, something ordinary, and how much energy it had taken to keep that narration going. She called a family attorney the following morning. The attorney, a woman who had been recommended through a friend of Carol's, met with Diana twice in the first week. She was direct and unhurried, the kind of professional Diana responded to instinctively, and she laid out the landscape of what was ahead in plain language. She advised Diana to keep all communication with Marcus in writing from this point forward. She recommended that Diana begin compiling a clear picture of the couple's shared finances, accounts, assets, property, any outstanding debts, before any formal conversations about division began. She said this not as an alarm, but as standard procedure. It was simply better to know the full picture before anyone started negotiating what belonged to whom. Diana had always managed the household expenses. She knew their checking and savings accounts, their mortgage balance, the approximate value of what they had set aside over the years in a retirement account they both contributed to. She also knew, because she had signed documents when it was opened, that Marcus maintained a separate investment account he described as a professional fund. Money he moved around in connection with his real estate work, he'd said, potential partnerships, and small development projects that required a degree of financial flexibility. She had never paid close attention to it because he had always presented it as something peripheral to their actual life, a professional tool rather than a shared asset. She began to pay attention to it now. It was during the third week that Stacey Owens called. Diana did not recognize the number and almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. She couldn't have said what afterward, only that there had been a quality to the timing of it that felt significant. The way certain moments do when you're already standing at a crossroads and the phone rings and something in you knows before you pick it up that this is not an ordinary call. Stacey introduced herself as someone who had worked with Marcus at his agency until several months ago. Her voice was careful, the particular carefulness of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say, but is still uncertain about saying it. She asked if they could meet in person. Diana said she could meet her the following afternoon. They sat across from each other in a coffee shop on the quieter end of downtown, a place with low ceilings and small wooden tables, and the kind of background noise that gave a conversation a reasonable degree of privacy. Stacey was in her mid-30s, with dark eyes and the slightly compressed expression of someone carrying something they were relieved to finally set down. She wrapped both hands around her cup and started talking before Diana could ask anything. She had worked as an administrative coordinator for Marcus's agency for almost 3 years. In the months before she left, Marcus had asked her on several occasions to help him organize documents related to what he described as a new investment opportunity, an independent development project he was putting together outside of the agency, something he was building quietly before making it public. She had assumed it was legitimate. He was a licensed broker. He spoke about it with the ease of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and he had given her no reason to look more closely. She had left the agency for another position and thought little more of it. Then, about 2 weeks after Diana moved out of the house, Stacey had run into Marcus's former business partner at a professional event, a man who had been loosely involved in the investment project in its early stages before withdrawing. They had spoken briefly, and what the man said had stayed with her. He had said that the project was never fully registered, that several of the transfers Marcus had made into the development account over the past year and a half had come from personal funds rather than the professional capital Marcus had claimed, that some of those personal funds appeared from the documents Marcus had given him to come from joint savings. Stacey set her cup down. She looked directly at Diana and said that she wasn't entirely sure what any of it meant legally, but that she had copies of some of the emails Marcus had sent her while organizing those documents, emails in which he had been explicit about where certain amounts were coming from and where they were going. She had kept them without knowing exactly why, only with the feeling that someday she might need them. She slid a manila envelope across the table. Diana did not open it immediately. She looked at it for a moment, her hands flat on the table on either side of it, and then she looked at Stacey and asked why she was bringing this to her now. Stacey was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had helped organize those documents without understanding what she was helping with. And she said that 2 days ago, a mutual acquaintance had mentioned, without knowing any of the details, that Marcus appeared to be spending a great deal of time with a woman he had recently met through work. Diana held Stacy's gaze and said nothing. "He's not trying to save your marriage," Stacy said, not unkindly. "I don't think he has been for a while. And I think he made some financial decisions before any of this became official that you need to know about." Diana picked up the envelope. She held it in her lap for the remainder of the conversation, through Stacy's apology for not coming sooner, through the careful goodbyes at the door of the coffee shop, through the walk back to her car in the late afternoon sun. She sat behind the wheel for a moment, the envelope on the passenger seat, and thought about the investment account she had never examined closely, the one Marcus had described as a professional tool, peripheral to their actual life. She thought about the word peripheral. She thought about how much can be hidden in the margins of a life that two people are supposedly sharing, how much space exists just outside the edges of what one person is willing to see when they are busy choosing to believe the version they've been given. She started the car. She had an appointment with the attorney the next morning, and now she had something to bring to it. Whatever Marcus had been building quietly in the background of their marriage, and she was beginning to understand that there was more than one thing, he had apparently not considered the possibility that someone else might have been paying attention all along. The attorney's name was Patricia Wells, and she had the kind of office that felt deliberately unintimidating. Warm lighting, plants on the windowsill, chairs that were actually comfortable. Diana had noticed this on her first visit and appreciated it, the same way she appreciated that Patricia spoke to her like someone who was capable of understanding her own situation, rather than someone who needed to be protected from it. She set the manila envelope on the desk between them and watched Patricia go through it without rushing. The emails were printed on plain paper, the kind of correspondence that looks unremarkable in isolation and significant in sequence. Marcus had written to Stacy over the course of several months, in the tone he used for practical matters. Businesslike, efficient, stripped of anything personal. But the content of what he had written, laid out in chronological order, showed a pattern of transfers that moved money from a joint savings account into the development fund in increments small enough to avoid drawing immediate attention. Some transfers were labeled as professional expenses. Others had no label at all. The total, across 18 months, was a number that made Diana sit very still when Patricia read it aloud. She had known, in an abstract way, that something was wrong. Stacy's face across the coffee shop table had told her that much. But there was a difference between knowing something abstractly and hearing it stated as a specific figure. And Diana felt that difference move through her now like cold water. Patricia set the emails down and looked at her. "He's been preparing," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Diana said. "Then we need to move carefully, and we need to move thoroughly." Patricia explained what the next steps would look like. A formal request for full financial disclosure as part of the divorce proceedings, a forensic review of the accounts if necessary, a close examination of the development fund to determine what portion of its current value came from marital assets. She said that Marcus would almost certainly claim the transfers were legitimate business expenses, and that his position would be easier to defend if the documents were incomplete. The emails Stacy had provided were useful precisely because they were contemporaneous, written in the moment, before anyone was managing a narrative. Diana asked how long all of it would take. Patricia said it was unlikely to be quick. These things rarely were when one party had been deliberate about their financial positioning. She said Diana should prepare herself for a process that would be measured in months rather than weeks, and that the most important thing Diana could do during that time was remain steady and let the documentation speak. Diana nodded. She thought about what steady had cost her so far and decided it was a currency she had more of than she had previously realized. She left the office and drove to the shop. She had been back at work since the end of the first week, which had surprised some people and surprised her not at all. The shop was the one place where the world continued to make an uncomplicated kind of sense. Flowers came in cold and wet on Tuesday and Friday mornings. Orders went out arranged and wrapped, and on time. The cooler needed to be restocked, and the display window needed to be refreshed, and the wholesale invoices needed to be reconciled at the end of every week. And all of it required a quality of attention that left very little room for anything else. Diana had always found work clarifying. She found it more so now. She had also, quietly and without announcement, begun expanding. It had started almost by accident. One of her regular customers mentioned that she was helping to organize a corporate luncheon, and the original florist had canceled. Diana had said yes before fully calculating whether she had the capacity, and then had spent the following 3 days making sure she did. The arrangements came out well. The client asked if she handled events regularly. Diana said she was expanding in that direction, which was true from the moment she said it, even if it hadn't been true the moment before. She reached out to 2 event venues in the area over the following weeks. The first meeting went nowhere. The second, held in a bright room above a renovated space on the east side of downtown, resulted in a conversation that ran almost 2 hours and ended with an informal agreement to work together on a trial basis for 3 upcoming events. It was through this partnership that she met Nathan Cole. He was overseeing the renovation of an adjoining room that the venue wanted to open for smaller gatherings, and he had been present at the second meeting by coincidence, waiting for the venue manager to review some plans when Diana arrived. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with the unhurried way of moving that belonged to people who worked with their hands and had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He had listened to her describe her floral vision for the space and asked 2 questions that were specific enough to tell her he had actually been paying attention. They had spoken professionally 6 times over the following weeks. He knew how to stay out of the way on a busy setup day and how to be useful on a complicated one. He did not talk more than the situation required, which was a quality Diana respected more than she ever said out loud. She was rearranging a standing order display near the front of the shop on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after her meeting with Patricia, when the bell above the door sounded, and she looked up and found Marcus standing just inside the entrance. He was holding a folder of papers, documents from the divorce proceedings that his attorney had prepared for her review, he said, presenting this as the reason for coming in person rather than sending them through the proper channel they had established for exactly this kind of exchange. She took the folder from him without comment. He lingered, looking around the shop the way people look at a place they expected to find changed and haven't. Nathan appeared from the back room at that moment, carrying a sample board of finish materials he had brought by for Diana to look at in relation to the venue renovation. He said her name in the easy way of someone who had said it a number of times, set the board on the counter, and told her he could come back if she was in the middle of something. She said she wasn't, and she turned back to Marcus to tell him that her attorney would be in touch regarding the documents. Marcus left without another word. He called her that evening. She almost didn't answer. She had a policy now about phone calls. Most things went through the attorneys, and the things that didn't were documented carefully. But something in the frequency of the rings, 6 before it went to voicemail, and then immediately again, made her pick up. He was not shouting. Marcus rarely shouted. He was doing something more controlled and, in her experience, more deliberate. Speaking in the measured tone of someone who has decided to present their anger as reason. He said he didn't think it was appropriate for her to be spending time with another man while their divorce was still in process. He said he had come to the shop in good faith and walked into something that made him feel humiliated. He said he had a right to know whether she was involved with someone. Diana sat with the phone against her ear and let him finish. "I'm not involved with anyone," she said. A brief pause. Something in his voice shifted. She could hear it. A fractional softening, almost imperceptible. The sound of a man who has just received news he wasn't sure he wanted but finds he is relieved by it anyway. She recognized the relief. She recognized what it meant. It meant that some part of him had still been doing the calculation, still holding open the possibility that she was waiting, still believing, on some level, that the door she had walked through when she left was a door he could pull her back through if the timing was right. "Then I just need to know," he started. "I declined an invitation," she said, "because I'm not ready. That's all." "So, there was someone," he said. "An invitation?" "Yes." "And you turned it down?" He said this as if it confirmed something for him, as if her refusal was a signal directed at him. She had intended to end the call there. She had intended to say that anything further should go through their attorneys and hang up. But something in the specific texture of his assumption, the ease with which he had absorbed her refusal as evidence of his own continued relevance, made her decide to say the thing she had been carrying quietly for several weeks. "I didn't turn it down for your sake, Marcus." He was quiet. "I turned it down for mine," she said, "because I'm not finished understanding who I am outside of this marriage before I bring someone else into my life. That has nothing to do with you. It never did." Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The controlled reasonableness was gone, replaced by something rawer and less rehearsed. He said she couldn't rewrite what they had built together. He said 11 years was not nothing. He said that whatever mistakes he had made, she was not entirely without fault in the distance that had grown between them, and that she knew it. He said the man in the shop was clearly interested in her, and she was not as oblivious to it as she was pretending to be, and that her telling herself otherwise was its own kind of dishonesty. Diana stood at the window of Carol's spare room, looking out at the backyard in the dark, and felt the conversation shift into the territory she had been expecting since the beginning. The territory where, having run out of apology, Marcus would begin redistributing responsibility. It was not a surprise. It was, in some ways, the most clarifying thing he had done since all of this began, because it showed her, with a finality that no amount of flowers or long messages could undo, that what he was offering her was not genuine accountability. It was negotiation. He was not sorry in the way a person is sorry when they understand what they have done. He was sorry in the way a person is sorry when they realize they are losing something they had assumed would still be there when they were ready to want it again. "All future communication through the attorneys," she said, and ended the call. She stood at the window for a while longer after that, the phone in her hand, the backyard dark and still below. She thought about the documents in Patricia's office. She thought about the months of transfers, the careful, incremental movement of money that Marcus had apparently planned with a precision he had never once applied to the question of whether she was happy. She thought about Stacy sitting across from her in the coffee shop, with her hands around her cup, setting down something she had been carrying alone. And she thought about Nathan, about the way he had set the sample board on her counter without making anything of the moment, and she thought about how uncomplicated it had felt. Just two people in a room, both of them busy with their own work, taking up only the space they needed. She didn't know yet what the financial review would uncover in full. She didn't know how many more months the process would require, or how many more times Marcus would call at the wrong hour trying to locate the version of her that might still be reachable. She didn't know whether the expansion of the shop would hold, whether the venue partnership would grow into something lasting, whether the first employee she was beginning to think seriously about hiring would be the right person. There was a great deal she didn't know. But when she turned away from the window and sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the small framed photo Carol had placed on the dresser. The two of them at maybe 12 years old, sunburned and grinning at a lake somewhere. She realized that the uncertainty did not frighten her the way it had at the beginning. It felt, instead, like space, like a room that had been crowded for a long time, finally emptied enough to see the walls clearly, and to start thinking about what she actually wanted to put in it. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday morning in late autumn, in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building downtown, with both attorneys present and a window that looked out over a street where the trees had gone almost entirely bare. Diana wore a gray blazer she had bought for a vendor meeting 3 months earlier and had her hair down, and she sat across the table from Marcus for the last time as his wife, with her hands folded in front of her and her expression exactly as composed as she had trained herself to keep it. The financial review had taken 4 months. What it had uncovered, in the careful, documented language of forensic accounting, was a pattern of transfers totaling just over $47,000 moved from their joint savings into the development account across 18 months. Marcus's attorney had argued, persistently and with considerable creativity, that the transfers represented legitimate professional investments made with the implicit understanding of both parties. Patricia had countered with Stacy's emails, with the account registration documents that listed Marcus as sole controller, and with a series of withdrawals from the development fund that had been redirected into a personal account Diana had no knowledge of and no access to. The final agreement reflected the full value of the marital estate, including the portion Marcus had moved. He did not receive the financial advantage he had spent a year and a half quietly constructing. The number Diana walked away with was not a windfall. It was simply what was already hers, returned to her intact, which was the only thing she had ever asked for. At the end of the signing, Marcus looked across the table at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not anger, not the negotiated remorse of the early weeks, but something quieter and more private, as if he were genuinely trying to understand how he had arrived at this particular room on this particular morning. He said he had never imagined she would find out as much as she had, as quickly as she did. Diana looked at him for a moment before she answered. She thought about the things she could say. The 14 seconds of a phone call, the paper in a kitchen drawer, the folder Stacy had set across a coffee shop table with both hands. She thought about all the ways she could explain to him that the discovery had not been quick, that it had been accumulating for months before she ever reached into his pocket. "I've been paying attention for a long time," she said. "I just stopped explaining away what I saw." She gathered her copies of the signed documents, shook Patricia's hand, and left the room. She was in the car with both hands on the wheel before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the morning. Not grief, she realized. Or not only grief. Something more composite than that. Relief, certainly. And beneath the relief, something she identified slowly and with some surprise as gratitude, though not the kind directed at anyone in particular. Gratitude for the version of herself that had gotten up before dawn that Monday morning, and made coffee and placed a piece of paper on a kitchen table, and asked one quiet question without her voice breaking. She had not known, sitting there, that she was capable of everything that came after. She had simply done the next thing, and then the next one, and somewhere in the accumulation of those small, steady actions, she had become a woman she recognized more clearly than the one who had loaded a washing machine on a Sunday evening and told herself the silence between them was just the natural rhythm of a life settling in. She drove to the shop. It was a Wednesday, which meant the delivery from her main wholesaler was already stacked in the back room waiting to be sorted. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, the arrangements were running heavy on amber and burgundy, on branches of bittersweet and stems of dried cotton that her customers had taken to more enthusiastically than she had anticipated. She had hired her first employee 6 weeks earlier, a young woman named Jess who had a background in art and an instinct for proportion that Diana had recognized immediately and trusted without hesitation. Jess was already at the work table when Diana came through the back door, sorting stems with the focused quiet of someone who understood that mornings in a flower shop were for working, not conversation. "Everything okay?" Jess asked without looking up. "Yes," Diana said, and then, because it was true, "Everything's done." Jess nodded once and went back to the stems. Diana changed into her work apron, tied it at the back, and stood at the cooler for a moment looking at what they had. There was a corporate order due Thursday. 24 centerpieces for a company dinner, clean and architectural, mostly white with accents of deep green. There was a wedding consultation Friday afternoon, a young couple who wanted something wildflower and effortless for a spring ceremony. And there was, tucked into the corner of the schedule board in Jess's handwriting, a note reminding her that the venue on the east side had reached out about 2 additional events in January, which would bring their total partnership bookings for the new year to 7. 7 events. A year ago, she had been running the shop alone on a stable but narrow margin, the kind of business that sustained itself without ever quite becoming what she had imagined it could be. She had been pouring her energy into a marriage that was asking her to look away from too many things at once, and the shop had reflected that. Careful, consistent, slightly smaller than her actual vision for it. She thought about that as she began sorting the delivery, moving through the cold room with practiced efficiency. She thought about how much of herself she had been managing, rationing, holding in reserve. Not because Marcus had asked her to. He had never asked her to. She had done it on her own, quietly and without identifying it as a loss, the way people do when they are trying to hold 2 things together and have stopped noticing how much of the holding falls to one set of hands. She was still thinking about this when the bell above the front door rang at just past 11, and she came out from the back to find Nathan Cole standing inside the entrance, a rolled set of drawings under his arm, looking at the display window with the particular attention he brought to anything spatial. "Didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "You're not," she said. "The venue called about January?" They did. He set the drawings on the counter and unrolled them. Revised floor plans for the adjoining room, which had turned out to be a more complex renovation than originally projected. He walked her through the timeline changes with the same economy he brought to everything. No more words than the information required, his attention on the plans and not on whatever she might be thinking. This was, she had come to understand over the past several months, simply how he was. He did not perform consideration. He just extended it, naturally and without apparent effort, the way some people do who have long since stopped needing anything from the performance. When they had finished going over the plans, he rolled them back up and tucked them under his arm, and then he looked at her with the directness she had gotten used to. "How are you doing?" he asked. Not as a pleasantry. He meant it literally. "The divorce was finalized this morning," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad it's done," he said. And she believed him. She believed him the way you believe people who don't say more than they mean. He picked up his drawings. He was almost at the door when he turned back, not dramatically, just the turn of a man who had decided to say something he had been holding at an appropriate distance for a reasonable amount of time. "There's a place on Merchant Street that does a good cup of coffee," he said. "If you ever want company that doesn't require anything from you." Diana looked at him. She thought about the last time he had said something like this, and the answer she had given, and the particular kind of clarity that answer had come from. She had meant every word of it. She had not been ready. She had needed to know who she was when she was not organizing herself around someone else's choices, and she had spent the past several months finding out. And what she had found was a woman she did not need to diminish or explain or hold carefully in reserve. She was not the same person who had stood in a kitchen at 1 in the morning and listened to 14 seconds of someone else's voice and felt her life reframe itself in the dark. "I know the place," she said. And something shifted in his expression. Not triumph. Nothing so uncomplicated as that. Just the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had been patient with each other and were ready, in their own time, to see what patience had made possible. He left. The bell above the door settled. Diana stood at the counter for a moment, her hand resting on the edge of it, and then she went back to work. She closed the shop alone that evening, the way she always did on Wednesdays. Jess had left at 5, and the last order had gone out at 4:30, and now it was just Diana, and the clean smell of cold water and green stems, and the low hum of the cooler, and the particular stillness of a space that had held a full day of work and was now resting. She moved through the closing routine without thinking. Lights in the back room, thermostat, the small radio she kept near the register. She stood for a moment in the middle of the shop, looking at the arrangement she had built that afternoon, and set in the window for tomorrow's display. Bittersweet branches, ivory roses, sprigs of eucalyptus catching the low light. It was good work. She knew it without needing anyone to tell her. She thought about the paper, the folded square she had found in a pocket on a Sunday evening that had seemed, in the moment of finding it, like such a small thing. She understood now that it had not been the beginning of anything. It had been the end of a long pretending. Hers as much as his, if she was being honest with herself, which she was trying to be more consistently now. She had known something was wrong long before that paper. She had simply been choosing, morning after morning, to rewrite what she knew into something she could live with more easily. What had changed that night was not what she saw. What had changed was that she had stopped being willing to explain it away. The divorce, the money recovered, the shop expanded, the quiet possibility of something new just beginning to take shape. None of it was the thing she was most grateful for. Those were the outcomes of a hard year. They were real, and they mattered, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But the thing she would carry forward, the thing she understood now that she had not understood before, was that she had sat in the dark that night with something she did not want to know, and she had chosen not to look away from it. And that choice, made quietly and without witnesses at 1 in the morning, in a kitchen that smelled like eucalyptus and cold water, had been the beginning of her own life in a way that nothing before it had quite managed to be. She turned off the last light. The shop went dark around her, and through the window the street outside was lit with the amber of the evening lamps, and she could see her own reflection in the glass, just briefly, before she moved toward the door. She looked like someone who had stopped waiting to be chosen. She looked like someone who had finally, after a very long time, chosen herself. She locked the door behind her and walked to her car, and the night was cool and clear, and she did not look back. If you watch this all the way to the end, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It takes you just a second, but it means everything to me. Drop a comment below and tell me what you thought. I read every single one. Thank you for the company and the coffee, and I'll see you in the next story.